Hello and welcome to this, the next in the series of A3 Management Consulting's webinar series. I think it's a very interesting one we're covering today. It's to do with climate change and disclosures, especially corporate disclosures. I would just like to say that we are going to be recording the webinar and sending the slides around later on, so don't worry if there's any issues through the webinar with your connectivity. You'll be able to pick it up later on. My name is Matt Brown. I'm Vice President for the energy part of management consulting within AFRI, and I'm joined by a couple of colleagues today who are going to take us through the presentation as usual. So I don't know if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Yeah, hello everybody. This is Andy Houston, Director at AFRI Management Consulting and Head of the Energy team in AFRI's London office.
And hello, my name is Alex Luta. I've been with AFRI since 2016, and I've been working for 12 years at the interface of climate and energy policy, and I work in Oxford.
So I think we'll do some Q&A at the end of the session. The session is an hour long today, a little longer than some of the previous ones. We have had some questions through on registration, and people, please do put questions on during the webinar. We'll deal with a few at the end, and then we will follow up with people and answer questions directly and get in touch that way. So it's well worth doing. And I hope you enjoy the webinar. With that, I will hand over to Andy to take us through. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Matt, and hello everybody. It's a pleasure to be presenting to you all today. So I thought I'd just start off, as all webinars do these days, talking about COVID, and I just wanted to have a little look at COVID in the context of climate change. So what we're showing on this chart is some projections, and there are a wide range of projections out there, of course, but some projections of the potential economic cost of COVID versus climate change. And what you can see in the blue on the left-hand side of this chart is the IMF's projections of how much COVID might cost the economy compared to a non-COVID baseline. And we're talking about, depending on which scenario you look at, somewhere between 5, 7.5, 8% hit on GDP this year, global GDP, which translates to about 6 or 7 trillion US dollars this year, and then about 2/3 of that next year. But just to put that in context, you can see climate change, although it's a much longer term phenomena, is also much bigger and goes on potentially forever. So the climate change numbers here are projections from the OECD of the economic cost versus a baseline in which there isn't any climate change, and just taking the numbers from 2020. And I guess just a couple of headline figures. So by 2060, climate change potentially is equivalent to 1 COVID every year. And by 2080, it's equivalent to 2 COVIDs a year, and by the end of the century, more like 5 COVIDs a year. So just to put climate change in context, yes, it's a long way away, but it's also enormous. So the other bit of context I wanted to look at is with COVID dominating the political, media, and every other agenda at the moment. Is it going to get in the way of climate change responses? And I think the policy statements on this so far are very much that it shouldn't do. Lots of uncertainty, of course, about how much money is available and how much will be put up. But the words so far are pointing in the direction of climate change remaining high on the agenda. And in particular, we've got people like Angela Merkel, Andrew Bailey of the Bank of England saying that they see climate change spending being part of the response to COVID and be part of the growth agenda beyond COVID. We see at the European level similar statements, and we see the business lobby also quite supportive of maintaining investment and climate change trajectory, the whole green agenda. So yes, there's some uncertainty, but at the moment it doesn't look like COVID is going to get in the way of climate change once we get past the immediate crisis response. So what are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk first about climate-related risk and just recap on what sort of risks companies, assets, investors, lenders, what sort of risks people are facing from climate change. Then I'm going to hand over to Alex, who's going to go through what the disclosure regimes, financial disclosure regimes look like as people try to measure those risks and feed them back up through the financial system. So that regulators, governments, investors, lenders can get a grip on what climate change means. Going to look at a bit of a case study of the UK and in particular the Bank of England response, and then at the end we'll sort of come back, bring it all together, wrap up, and answer any questions that have come through. So just a little bit of a reminder, I'm sure people are familiar with this, but in terms of where we are today, as of 2018, we're about 1 degree warming above the pre-industrial average. And then you look at where the Paris goals are beyond that, and we're at 1.5 degrees, maybe up to 2 degrees. So we are looking at very limited additional climate change being the aspiration. But we're still quite a long way from achieving that. So if you look at current policies, maybe 3 degrees change, maybe up to 4. And then if you look at more optimistic policies and the pledges that have been made, maybe that brings that down a little bit, sort of in the 2.5 to 3.5 range. But I suppose what's coming out of this is both that given the current policy landscape, we're likely to see more climate change unless there's a lot more policy action taken. And that those policies will impact on people as they're implemented. And again, just a reminder of what sort of parts of the energy system might get impacted by climate change. Yes, I've just broken it down very simply into 3 areas. So there's power generation, which is my own focus, and I guess a lot of people on the call. We see the phase out of fossil fuel fired generation, particularly highly emitting coal generation. Obviously a big increase in renewables, wind, solar, other renewables, and then perhaps more of a question mark around other low carbon technologies and more of a patchwork approach around the globe. Some companies will deploy a lot of nuclear plants to cut carbon emissions, and some won't. Some might have the ability to put CCS on the ground, some won't. And then there's question marks around new technologies such as hydrogen and so on. But it's not just about the power generation side. So if we can look at transport and heat sectors, we expect to see a huge increase in electric vehicle use. It's already happening. It's likely to grow exponentially in coming years. Perhaps also hydrogen vehicles as we move into the slightly longer term future. And we're going to see change in use of heating as well. So in buildings, both a reduction in the total energy used to heat buildings as they become more efficient, and a change in the fuels away from fossil fuels. And then finally, we see new technologies coming on. So hydrogen and CCS I've mentioned to some extent already, but we're moving also into a world where batteries are a major component of the system, from 5 years ago where they were really demonstration scale to the point now where they're having big impacts on grids in real life. So as climate change happens, what sort of risks are people looking at? What sort of risks do we need to consider? They really break down into 2 broad areas. Those related to physical risk, and these are related to the actual physical change in the climate and the things that come with it, like sea level rise, increased temperature, change in precipitation, change in windiness, and so on. But also the transitional risk, and these are the risks that come from climate policy. So as we try to mitigate climate change, we see policies come in, and those policies can have impacts on assets and companies as well, whether that's through carbon price or subsidies or reputational consequences or whatever they might be. So I'll come back to those in a little bit more detail in a minute. I guess as we see the climate change transition happening, we see a huge amount of capital required to flow into the system. And all of that capital that flows in leads to a need to understand what climate change means and what the risks are. So just to look really simplistically at that, if we put your business, your assets, your company in the center of the screen here, and we just look at how it's impacted. So it's impacted by the physical world, which is the physical risk side, and then because of the inevitable policy response, which we're already seeing a great deal of, an impact on the political economy as well. There's also the financial world. So we have equity and debt flowing into businesses, whether that's coming from funds, from utilities, from asset managers, individuals, whoever, and debt coming from banks, insurers, and so on. So all of the money flows into the business, but what happens then is that risk flows back out of the business. So it trickles down from the physical risks and transition risks into individual businesses, those that hold the assets, but then it trickles back to the shareholder and the debt holder levels. And the whole disclosure regime that we're going to talk about in the second half of this presentation is really about understanding how those risks flow down to into the financial community, and what the frameworks are likely to be around that in the future. So just to make it all live a little bit before we get into the policy side, I thought I'd just look a little bit about what climate change can actually mean for assets. I've just got a subset of assets here and really focused on Europe. Looking at the physical impacts of climate change first, so just picking some out: increased temperature, more extreme precipitation, and rainier, less rainy, sea level rise, and then other, and looking at the effect that has on some different asset classes. So for wind generation, we see increased temperature, for example, leading to lower air density, having an impact on wind turbine efficiency as a consequence. We see more damage to offshore turbines from sea level rise. We see changes in wind direction, wind speed, seasonality that can all affect individual assets differently. Solar generation affected quite differently, so lower efficiency as the temperature rises, obviously big change in the output from clouds effectively, and then if we're talking about CSP instead of PV, then we're also talking about the availability of water. And just a final category to look at: hydro generation can benefit from more melting, perhaps in the short term, so you end up with more water flowing in, but then what's the knock-on impact in the longer term for hydro that's glacier fed? As the glaciers melt, you end up with problems there. You also end up with higher evaporation in more arid regions. The inflows into hydro can become more extreme, which can change both the running pattern and cause issues for maintenance of the turbines. And we also see more competition with alternative water use, particularly from irrigation using crops. So the picture's complicated. It's different between different asset types, and it's not a single effect for each asset. And if we start to look geographically, it gets even more complicated. So just looking again at the three asset classes we just talked about. So this is borrowing some information from some scientific studies, and there's quite a wide range of views out there. So just synthesizing some of those. In Northern Europe, we might see an upside or a downside on wind volumes, depending on the exact geography. It could be a fairly big downside or a fairly big upside. Whereas when we start looking down in Southern Europe, Mediterranean region, it generally is a downside from there. Solar generation complicated again, so less solar radiation in Scandinavia, perhaps a bit more in Western Europe, less in Central Eastern Europe, but potentially more down in Turkey and the Eastern Mediterranean. And for hydro generation, generally an upside in the north, a downside in the south, and quite landscape temperature dependent in the middle regions. So I think the message here is, once we start looking at the different asset types and the different locations, the impacts of climate change are very complicated and really deserve looking at in a sophisticated way. So just to finish up then on the other side of the risk spectrum, on the transition risks. And the chart here is showing decarbonisation targets and ambitions relative to a 1990 baseline. And clearly there's been quite a lot of progress made by 2017 for various reasons. And 2020 targets don't look too problematic in that context. But the ambition gets significantly greater by 2030 and by 2050, as shown on the blue dot and the blue bar. 2050 has a bit of a range on it. And if we move towards proposed targets, proposed changes in the EU targets, we're looking at basically 0 by 2050 and more ambition in 2030. So big transition being planned across Europe at least. And this has lots of implications for the energy sector. I guess people can all think of their own as it relates to their own businesses, but just to pick up on a few, carbon prices are likely to increase very significantly with consequent knock-on negative impacts on fossil fuel-fired generation, potentially an upside for renewable generation, at least in the medium term. We're likely to see a patchwork of subsidy regimes remaining around Europe and around the world, which can be great if you're getting the subsidies and they're at a good level, but perhaps not so good if you're fall outside the subsidy regime due to eligibility or because a subsidy regime is brought in after you've built your own plants. And then we see the standard cannibalization of renewables revenues, so you get more and more intermittent renewables on the system. They tend to compete with each other, and we see them capturing gradually lower and lower prices. Also shifts away from value in energy markets and towards different markets. So the value of a megawatt hour is likely to decrease in the future on a like-for-like basis. But the value of flexibility perhaps will increase as we need things to provide backup for intermittent renewable generation. The value of flexibility and capacity increases. And I think thinking slightly away from the normal fundamentals, there's also pressure, increasing pressure coming from institutional investors with regards to wanting to invest in lower carbon assets and renewable assets. And as the demand for investments in renewable assets increases and the relative demand for investments in fossil fuel-fired assets decreases, we see a divergence in the cost of capital, and it becomes gradually more expensive to finance high carbon emitting assets. So all of these transition risks are likely to bite as well. And taking all of these physical and financial risks together, putting them in a pot, I think the question is how does the global governance mechanism work? How do people report this financially? How do investors manage to grapple with all these changes that are coming? So with that, I'm going to hand over control of the presentation to Alex, who's going to take us through the next part and to talk about the forthcoming disclosure regime.
Hello, everyone. So thank you, Andy. So now that we know that the financial sector is aware of different kinds of climate-related risk, and this awareness is spreading to other people as well, let's see what is being done about that. So first, what we need to understand is that the climate problem is a global problem, and therefore it requires a global response. So this response that has materialized inside the financial community has started at that level in organizations of the highest possible level of seniority. So we're talking about central banks, ministries of finance, international institutions such as the World Bank, and so forth. And there have been two bodies that have created and are still developing a new disclosure regime. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures is the one that has articulated what we expect you as our clients to have to comply with in the future. And the Network for Greening the Financial System is the one who is responsible for creating the scenarios that will go into the robustness analyses that companies are going to be subjected to. So where is this going to be implemented, and are you going to be affected? And this map here shows basically the countries which are spearheading this effort. And in dark green, you can see the countries who are most closely connected with this effort. The United Kingdom, but also Germany and France and Sweden in Europe. But you can see that there's been an effort to diffuse this disclosure regime into other geographies as well. And there are lots of other countries which are, while not directly involved with the formulation of this disclosure regime or with the scenarios that will have to be implemented, but who are observing the process very closely. So in those light green jurisdictions, we expect this disclosure regime to take root maybe a little bit later, and then in the dark green regions. Finally, many important countries such as the United States and Russia, the Middle Eastern countries and so forth, are countries which for obvious political reasons are not engaged with this process at the moment. So it is an open question about when they're going to join. But I think what we would like to emphasize at this point is perhaps a parallel to the data regime that EU has set up in the context of GDPR, which is quickly evolving towards becoming a globally relevant standard. So once a critical mass of countries joins this effort, we expect momentum to pick up and this to become part of a standard. So moving along, this global effort now is trickling down towards implementation at the national level. So currently we're seeing central banks, ministries of finance, and stock exchanges considering the implementation of these disclosure regimes. And by implementation, it simply means that the next rung down, so these are commercial banks, commercial insurers, asset owners, and asset managers having to implement this disclosure regime at home, try to establish how their business model measures up in terms of robustness to climate change. And that will take us finally to you, our clients, which make up the vast bulk of the real economy. All these banks and all these asset managers don't have as much direct exposure to climate risk as they do indirectly through the lending and financing activities that they do with you. So ultimately, we expect them to turn to you in the future to ask, how does your business hold up? How reliable are you as a counterpart for me as a bank? And this information then will trickle back upwards towards national central banks and the global governance institutions, which will unleash the kind of redirection of capital which is required if the world is to transition towards a zero carbon future. So what does this disclosure regime actually consist of? Let us talk briefly about that. Basically, it requires that companies spell out in places such as their annual financial statements what steps they have taken to manage the risk, physical or transitional, arising from climate change. And these types of responses fall into four broad categories. So the companies have to spell out what governance steps they have taken. So does the board and does the day-to-day management of the company discuss climate change and these risks on a frequent basis? What strategy then does the business have in order to adapt to the risks and also the opportunities which arise from climate change? Then concretely, in terms of risk management, this is where the scenario-based analysis becomes important, because one cannot manage what one does not measure, and therefore companies will have to go through an exercise to assess how they would respond today, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and so forth on the different possible climate scenarios. And fourth, companies have got to explain regularly what they have done in terms of measuring up to the targets that they have set themselves. So what are these targets? What progress have they made? What metrics are being employed, and so forth. These are the kinds of things that we expect most businesses to have to express fairly soon. And we'll see how soon when we look at the UK case study. Now, we have talked already with some of our clients, and we understand that there's already some awareness about the TCFD, the disclosure regime out there. Companies who support its diffusion are valued up to $12 trillion as of February. So there is awareness out there. Now, these disclosures are being produced by a certain group of companies and then utilized by a different group of companies. So let's talk about that for a second. So in terms of the users of the disclosures, the consumers thereof, these are mainly in the financial sector, and those financial companies, so we're talking banks, insurers, and so forth, who utilize them explicitly do so in order to guided decision making. And this is entirely natural. The purpose of these disclosures is to guide where these financial behemoths put their money. Now, on the other side of the equation lie the companies that prepare these disclosures. And this is where the rubber meets the road. And this is where we observe that there's been the most difficulty with the implementation of the TCFD regime. We see that companies find that standardization is lacking at the moment, and that utilizing scenario-based analysis is very difficult because even the scenarios are not standardized yet, and also implementing those scenarios to assess how business plans do against them has turned out to be quite difficult. Nevertheless, people who are preparing the TCFD are doing it because they're aware of the two main kinds of risk that Andy has talked about: transition risk and physical risk. And we find it particularly interesting to notice that the transition risk is of special interest to disclosure preparers because there's a lot of uncertainty about when policymakers will implement the inevitable policy response and to what extent they will do so. So, having explained in general what the disclosure regime does, let's have a look at a case study, the United Kingdom. And you're using the United Kingdom because it is one of the countries that have been spearheading this initiative. The role of the previous Bank of England governor, Mark Carney, is undeniable, but also because there have been a number of steps taken by various regulatory authorities to transpose this into domestic legislation. And we'll see shortly that it's not just the UK who's doing it, but this is the one that we're going to be talking about today. So in the UK, companies can be placed into three categories, mainly in terms of how they're going to be affected by this disclosure regime. On the one hand, we have banks and insurers who will fall under the so-called biennial exploratory scenario, which is spearheaded by the Bank of England. The participants here are going to be very, very large banks, so you can see them on the screen, as well as the largest insurers in the country. Most of this presentation is going to be dealing with this exploratory scenario, but I should also talk about premium listed companies on the London Stock Exchange. So this initiative is led not by the Bank of England, but by the Treasury, and they're trying to get all these premium listed companies to implement a somewhat lighter version of the process that banks and insurers will have to do, essentially trying to persuade them to comply with the TCFD regime, or explain why they don't comply. This might seem like these companies have a less onerous tasks in front of them, but if you think about the fact that banks and insurers are going to be investing into these premium listed companies, it is an interesting question indeed to wonder whether these very large non-financial companies are not going to have to do something of similar magnitude. As to the rest of businesses in the UK, formally they face no compliance obligation, but as this regime gains foothold more and more, the larger businesses in this category might also find the need to join the crowd. So for the remainder of this section, we're going to talk about the biennial exploratory scenario and describe why it's so important and how it affects more companies than it seems at face value. The purpose of the exercise is that the bank, so the Bank of England, would provide 3 scenarios. We're going to be talking about these 3 scenarios in a short while, but these are climate scenarios of how the physical world evolves and how the political economy responds to that evolution. And this information is going to flow out to the systemically important banks and insurers, who are going to have to do an analysis about how their balance sheets as they stand today would respond to the world 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the line, in accordance with the shocks that are embedded in the 3 scenarios provided by the Bank of England. This information is then gathered up, resubmitted to the Bank of England, and if the bank establishes that the way these really important financials respond to these shocks wreak havoc in the financial system, then this exercise would be repeated again with some refined scenarios. And finally, the bank would publish the results, probably in 2022. And that's when the world would get its first understanding of how robust the UK financial system as a whole is to the challenges imposed by climate change. Now, the scenarios themselves have a certain fixed set of input parameters, and the modeling that happens inside these very large financials has to consider the financial flows between themselves and their clients, so people whom they finance, whom they've invested into. And this is the reason why we believe that eventually even non-financial companies are going to have to engage with the scenario-based analysis, because ultimately banks will either have to do an analysis based on their best guess of the situation among their clients, or they're going to turn to their clients themselves and inquire, okay, how would you deal with these scenarios? And this is why even though the London Stock Exchange exercise is just a comply or explain regime currently, this is why we believe that it's going to be progressively more and more difficult to avoid engaging with this exercise. So to talk briefly about the scenarios, they have to do with the responses to climate change. The simplest one is a no additional policy action scenario. So this is where policy continues at the same rate as today, but no harsher measures are taken, and therefore climate change proceeds apace, and the world, so this is real businesses, financials, central banks, are going to have to absorb a lot of physical risk. The second scenario is the mirror image, where policy accelerates practically immediately, and therefore the nature of the risk is transformed from physical into transitional risk. And the third scenario is obviously something in between, where for the first 10 years are wasted, essentially. The acceleration of policy action against climate change is delayed by 10 years. Obviously, the physical risk, as Andy has shown at the beginning, does not materialize quite as quickly. It's not quite as harsh as one might think. However, the transition risk becomes much more severe when 10 years down the line, corrective action is taken to catch up and make up for the lost time. And here are the parameters which the Bank of England would be imposing. It is important to understand that the scenarios are not being produced by the Bank of England itself, which is not a body with climate expertise, but is being prepared by a consortium of climate scientists and financial experts within the network for greening the financial system, which we mentioned before. Obviously, as AFRI, we have a great deal of expertise, especially in the fields that are highlighted in blue. But we are coming to understand that the relevance of, for instance, temperature, pathways, which affects the functioning of asset classes, also the impact of macroeconomic variables such as GDP growth, unemployment, and so forth on the demand for electricity and other commodities. So this is where we feel we can step in and assist companies such as yourselves, be they banks or be they real economic companies, in the analysis of these scenarios, which are basically set in stone. Obviously, the Bank of England doesn't have a crystal ball about what the future is, and therefore they themselves have been at pains to paint this entire exercise as a learning opportunity. So by all means, we would like to also contribute to a constructive critique of the scenarios that are being produced right now. And now I would like to take a brief moment to talk about exactly that topic. So when one talks about climate scenarios, there's quite a wide range of them. Only 5 are being displayed here, but you must understand that they're in their hundreds. These are baseline scenarios that are very relevant today, and as you can see, they range in terms of the radiative forcing, is a technical word, that they achieve, so that the temperature increase reached by the end of the century between 1.5 degrees, which is the objective of the Paris Agreement, to up to 5 degrees worth of warming. And if you recall the chart that Andy showed in the beginning from Climate Action Tracker, we are heading right now to a world between 2.5 and 3 degrees Celsius. So it is very important to ensure that the scenarios which are going to be used in the stress tests are the appropriate ones. Unfortunately, we noticed that there's a very great obsession among the climate community with highly unlikely worst case scenarios, which is the 5-degree scenario that you see at the very top. And we would like to share with you how unlikely or quote unquote incredible the energy related assumptions of such a scenario might turn out to be. So to exemplify that, we're going to show you coal generation pathways under 2 different scenarios. So on the one hand, we have the highly unlikely but often described as business as usual scenario, leading to 5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And this is the type of growth in worldwide electricity generation from coal that is being expected under that scenario. So you can see that the increase is quite spectacular. However, a much more likely 3-degree scenario obtains a very radically different growth in generation. So what is the relevance of this to you? It would be a shame if the robustness or the viability of your business would be assessed against a scenario which doesn't seem to be very credible in terms of where we what do you expect the energy system to evolve. And the reason why there's such a big discrepancy between these two scenarios is because climate scientists have got to model high temperature increase scenarios in order to account for potential pitfalls in our knowledge about climate change, where there might be tipping points where runaway climate change might be triggered, but we don't really expect seriously today to have a tenfold increase in coal generation worldwide. So therefore, it is really important that as the energy community, we stand up and we express ourselves in case we have to be assessed based on unrealistic scenarios. So when will these scenarios come to affect you? What you see before you is the evolution of the system before COVID-19. So at the time, the binary exploiter scenarios were going to start during late 2020, and the discussions with the Treasury about the stock exchange exercise was under consultation. Now, the Bank of England side has been cancelled for this year, and the consultation for the Treasury has been postponed until October. But nevertheless, if you look at the intention, we were looking before COVID-19 at this entire exercise of wrapping up by the end of 2021, so that by 2022, companies such as yours would have had to publish disclosures that are compliant with the TCFD regime. Now, given what Andy has spoken about at the beginning, we expect this type of initiative to resume fairly quickly. And the reason why we're so confident is because we're seeing similar types of initiatives in other places. So very famously in 2019, in December, the taxonomy regulation has passed within the EU. What it does is that it forces investors, so asset managers and asset owners, plus companies listed on European stock exchanges, to disclose how their business models align with climate mitigation and climate adaptation, so that investors, such as pension funds or regular people who buy an index fund, can invest into the companies that are going to be around even after we deal with the physical or transition risk of climate change. And we see similar initiatives also progressing in France and Germany. And as you can see, the publication deadlines for documents in all of these places are around 2022 at the latest. Do we expect there to be some lag due to COVID? Yes, but we don't expect that to be on the magnitude of many years. At the most, we think it might be 2023 or thereabouts that this might become a reality. However, most of you are going to have to deal in some shape or form with this regime in the not too far future. So this wraps up our presentation. I will now hand over back to Andy to discuss our conclusions and present to you the actions that we're taking.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. So I'll just quickly wrap up, and then we'll move to some questions that have come through. So I suppose the sort of conclusions that we draw from the time we spent looking at this. So the first one really is that climate change impacts are complicated, both on the physical side and the transition side. They vary significantly by asset class and by geography. And I suppose, sitting in the part of AFRI that Alex and I sit in, we spend a lot of our time modelling the future and taking scenario-based views of the future. So our modelling already incorporates a lot of decarbonisation, and we can and are looking at all sorts of alternative scenarios with increased degrees of decarbonisation and different effects in different regions and different technologies and so on. Next one, please, Alex. So the other side of this, of course, is that yes, climate change is difficult and complicated, but then you've got an additional layer on top of that, which is that it doesn't just matter what you think and what we think, but it matters what regulators and governments think. So if they're enforcing disclosure regimes under certain scenarios, it's very important that we know what the scenarios are. Try to influence them, as Alex says, as far as possible to make sure that they're sensible scenarios. But ultimately, disclosure will have to happen under those scenarios. So it doesn't, as I said, might differ significantly from AFRI's view. Bank of England may have a different view of the world, and we'll still need to deal with that view. And within our modelling, we intend, as those scenarios become more public, to start incorporating them into our modelling suite. And then the final thing is that people, large companies, banks, trickling down into smaller companies, as Alex mentioned, will soon need to have to disclose all this. And so we are continuing to engage with clients on this and expect to be actively talking to people in the future. And of course, invite people to contact us after this webinar for any points they'd like to discuss bilaterally. And just finally, I'd just like to note that AFRI is a much bigger company than just scenario modelling, and we have engineering colleagues and environmental colleagues who are looking at all sorts of different aspects of climate change, and so can help with not only bank scenarios but all the other related aspects for the energy sector transition. So with that, I'll hand over to Matt to compare the Q&A. Matt.
Lovely, thanks, Andy. And yeah, worth noting we're now 17,000 experts across many areas and sectors, all areas of infrastructure, for instance. So we have had quite a few questions in. I will kick it off, if I may, with the first question. I'm not sure, Andy, Alex, which of you want to take it, but the question is, which approach do you suggest to quantify long-term climate change impact risks?
So I'll take that one, Matt. It's Andy speaking again. So I think the approaches probably differ. So I can see lots of different approaches being used for different circumstances. So if you want to explore risk for your own benefit in the future, developing scenarios, looking at what happens to your particular assets in the future, very important. You might want to understand, for example, P50 risks versus P90 risks, and then some bigger tail risks. On the other hand, the other side of this, as I said, is that some of this will be centrally imposed, and so also not only looking for your own purposes, but also making sure that whatever you're looking at for the future, whatever risk you're looking at, is compliant with the disclosure regime will be important. So maybe for some companies, they're looking at just the formal disclosure regime scenarios, and it may be for their others, they want to also look at a more granular and bespoke view of the future as well. I suspect that it depends on the nature of the company, nature of the asset, geographical location, and all sorts of things.
Okay, thanks very much. Next question. From your discussions, how prepared do you feel companies are to respond to the various disclosure requirements?
So We've spoken over the last few months to quite a few companies, ranging from funds to utilities to private equity to lending banks. I have to say that there's quite a wide range of degrees of preparedness out there. We've found a group of organisations that are totally on top of this, already doing disclosures to some extent and looking at how they can make those more sophisticated in the future. At the other end of the spectrum, we've seen people who have companies for whom this is barely on the radar. So perhaps the compliance department is watching it come down the road, but it hasn't really gone wider through the organisation at this stage. And then I think the largest chunk of organisations are in the middle. So probably 80% or so of the people we've spoken to have been aware of it, but still in the stages of deciding how to respond. So I think there's quite a wide range, but most people moving forward on it to some degree.
Excellent, thank you. And then this one, how will this vary between Europe and Asia?
I think I can take that one. So there's two answers that are important to be given here. One is to do with the direct effect, and the other one with the indirect effect. So if you recall the map that we were showing earlier, obviously most of the color was concentrated in Europe. So this is a European initiative, and there are some observers on the Asian side. So Japan, Thailand. I think Singapore is actually an active participant as well. But obviously, we don't expect observers to be implementing things quite as quickly as is happening in the UK, France, Germany. So I don't expect there to be any direct need for companies that are active on the ground in these geographies to have to do something by 2022. That being said, the indirect effect is undeniable. There has been a lot of communication, even in the public domain, about how certain banks that are active in the UK and are based in the UK are financing generation projects in Asia, Southeast Asia in particular, and these projects do not necessarily have the most constructive contribution to adapting to climate change, and certainly not to mitigate it. So as these UK-based entities are going to have to comply with this regime, and with the consequences thereof, as their own investors might turn away from them for having a quote-unquote dirtier portfolio, then these projects in Asia might discover that the taps have been turned off. Obviously, this will not happen overnight, but already we're seeing how certain coal generation projects in Southeast Asia are not taking off, and therefore we believe that this trend might continue and maybe even accelerate in the future.
Lovely, thank you very much for that. As I said, we will get back to everyone who has put either registration or questions during the seminar. If you could just, I think if you kick it on one more slide, whoever's in charge. If there is another slide, there we go. So, so if you want to talk to anyone, then you've got the contact details here. As I said, we'll send out a recording of the webinar together with the slide pack itself. So please make use of those. And next week we have where are gas prices heading. So obviously there's been significant impact on gas prices due to COVID-19, but gas prices, of course, were pretty soft at the beginning of the year, right at the beginning of the year anyway. The oil price war that has been going on hasn't really helped either. But what's the future for gas prices? So we're going to be talking about that next week, and then just as one of note, we are having weekly seminars, but just to note, in 25th of June, there is a webinar on key drivers of carbon prices itself, because obviously of the relation with this webinar, we thought you might be interested to take note of that and mark your calendar as well, that's coming up. So I think we're going to stop it there. I'd like to say thank you very much to Andy and to Alex. Very interesting again, and also to Johnny and Bev, who are helping organise these seminars. Hope you have a great rest of the day. Thanks. Bye-bye.